Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to treat biblical interpretation exactly like a thrilling detective's investigation. Whenever we pick up an ancient text, it's incredibly easy to just slip into passivity, right? To just let the words wash over us. But true understanding, that requires us to be active investigators. We need to look at the process of moving from mere observation, basically just noticing the facts of a text, to actual interpretation, which is solving the mysteries those facts leave behind. It's really all about building a sturdy bridge between what we see on the page and what it actually means. So we have to ask ourselves a pretty crucial question. Are you reading the Bible or just reading into it? We really need to ensure we're answering the mysteries raised by the text itself, rather than, forcing our own biases onto it. The most important part of any valid investigation is making sure the questions you're trying to answer actually arise from the evidence. If you interrogate a text with an agenda it never intended to address, well, your answers are always going to be suspect. To get us there, we have a clear roadmap for our investigation today. First, asking the right questions. Second, words, lexicons, and context. Third, tracing biblical word usage. Fourth, exploring scriptural testimony. And finally, fifth, genre, tone, and psychology. All right, let's jump right into section 1, asking the right questions. Every investigation has to start by selecting the right mystery to solve from your initial observations. You obviously can't investigate everything, so you've got to choose your battles wisely based on the clues that stand out the most. The absolutely crucial point here is avoiding a massive red herring. We must let the text set the agenda, not our preconceived notions. In the theological world, this trap has a name. It's called eisegesis. It's basically a deductive trap where you essentially put words in your suspect's mouth. Deductive interpretation throws questions at the text that the text simply is not prepared to answer. We want to draw meaning out, not cram our own meaning in. So how do we filter through the ton of questions you're inevitably going to generate? Well, we use a simple 3-step process. Step 1, ask yourself, what is most central to the dynamics of the text? Step 2, tackle the most difficult questions. Why? Because the friction is usually where the absolute best clues are hiding. And step 3, pursue questions of personal interest. What simply sparks your curiosity? Moving on to section 2, words, lexicons, and context. This is level 1 evidence, and it builds the rock-solid foundation of our entire textual investigation. Once you've got your question, you need hard data. Now, we really can't just rely on the English translation alone. We have to dig up the exact definition of the original word the author deployed. There's always going to be some slippage between the ancient Greek or Hebrew and the modern English equivalent. Think of the English translation like a composite sketch of your suspect, while the original Greek or Hebrew, that's the actual photograph. And hey, even if you don't know ancient languages, it's totally fine. Tools like the Blue Letter Bible or Thayer's Lexicon allow anyone to easily look up the foundational definition of the exact word the author chose. When you're hunting for clues, you want to pan out in 3 concentric circles. You always start at the epicenter, the immediate context, which is the surrounding verses. Then you zoom out a bit to the segment context, the broader literary unit. Finally, you look at the whole book context, the architecture of the entire text. Context is king. It is literally the one type of evidence that is absolutely always relevant to your case. Let's look at section 3, tracing biblical word usage. Next up, we track how our suspect, the specific word in question, operates elsewhere in the biblical corpus. Where else has this exact Greek or Hebrew word shown up, and what was it doing there? But watch out, because this is the ultimate detective's trap. Just because a word means something elsewhere doesn't mean your author's using it that exact same way right here. The scholar James Bauer famously coined this the illegitimate totality transfer. It's a very dangerous practice. It's the mistake of finding a word in your passage, looking at literally every other place it's used in the Bible, and then uncritically dumping all of that collective suggestiveness into your specific verse. Instead, we must carefully compare the usage, and we have to embrace the tension, because sometimes the differences between passages are actually the biggest clues of all. If a word is used the same way elsewhere, we have continuity. It really enriches our understanding. But if it's used differently, we have discontinuity. For example, Martin Luther was often critiqued for reading the Apostle Paul's specific, often very negative use of the word law into the writings of Matthew and James, who actually viewed the law quite positively. If we blur those lines, we completely destroy the unique evidence each writer brings to the table. Which brings us to section 4, exploring scriptural testimony. Let's pull back the lens even further and cross-examine witness testimonies from outside our immediate book. How do other biblical authors discuss the exact same historical events or concepts? Here is a really fascinating case of discontinuity in parallel accounts, where we absolutely must allow each author to speak with their own distinct theological voice rather than forcing them to match. In 2 Samuel chapter 24, we read that the Lord incited David to take a census, but the parallel historical account in 1 Chronicles 21 tells us that Satan stood up and incited David. These are two vastly different theological perspectives on the exact same event. The absolute worst thing an investigator can do here is silence one of those witnesses just to make the paperwork look cleaner. If we artificially blend parallel accounts together, like smashing Matthew 14 and John 6 into one story, we ruin the unique evidence each witness provides and build a completely distorted narrative. This actually happens all the time in preaching. A speaker will take the story of the feeding of the 5,000 from Matthew, surgically attach details from John's version, and preach this coalesced Frankenstein story. By doing this, you're effectively creating a brand new, non-canonical text that exists literally nowhere except in your own imagination. And you completely miss the unique point both Matthew and John were individually trying to make. Now, what's really interesting is how an author's viewpoint might actually differ from the viewpoint of a character speaking inside their own book. Take Acts chapter 2. Peter preaches that God is pouring out his Spirit on all flesh. Now, when Peter said that, he meant all classes of Jewish society. We know this for sure because it literally takes a vision from God chapters later to convince him to preach to Gentiles. But Luke, the author actually writing the book of Acts, he absolutely has the Gentiles in mind when he records those words. The author and the character are experiencing the exact same quote on two completely different levels. Let's dive into Section 5, Genre, Tone, and Psychology. For our final level of evidence, we're going to look at the powerful, intangible clues hidden right beneath the surface. This involves literary form, the emotional atmosphere, and the state of mind of the characters. Consider this famous genre disaster, which proves exactly why you can never investigate a standard historical prose narrative using the rules of allegory. There's this story of a preacher looking at Peter's escape from prison in Acts 12. He preached that the fetters falling off represented freedom from original sin, the two prison doors represented justification and sanctification, and arriving at the mother of John Mark's house meant reaching heaven and glorification. I mean, it's a very creative story, but it's a complete violation of literary genre. You just cannot allegorize historical prose without destroying the author's actual intent. And then there's tone. Take 1 Corinthians 4:8. Already you are filled. Already you have become rich. Without us, you have become kings. If you read this statement with a straight face, you will completely miss Paul's point. This brings us to the absolutely vital clue of tone and atmosphere. Paul is writing to the church in Corinth here. If you read this flatly, you might genuinely think he is congratulating them on their immense spiritual wealth and their royal status. But the crucial point is that tone changes everything. Paul is dripping with sarcasm here, telling the Corinthians they are actually spiritually bankrupt. Sarcasm is the subversive use of language. Because of the tone, the words literally mean the exact opposite of their dictionary definition. They aren't filled, they are empty. They aren't kings, they are poor. If you miss the tone, you botch the entire investigation. The same goes for psychology. We can only investigate the psychological state of a biblical character when the author's text explicitly leaves us clues inviting us to do so. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah goes from a massive, triumphant mountaintop victory over the prophets of Baal straight into suicidal depression under a broom tree. The text clearly practically begs us to look at his psychology. But contrast that with the book of Joshua during the conquest of Canaan. The author there deliberately uses language to keep the reader at arm's length from the emotions of the Canaanites. You must let the text dictate when psychology is a valid clue. Let's solve one final, brilliant mystery together by looking at the grammatical inflection of a single plural noun. In Matthew chapter 2, an angel tells Joseph to take Jesus back to Israel because those who sought the child's life are dead. Wait, those? Up to this point in the narrative, the only person trying to kill baby Jesus was King Herod. It's singular. So why does the text suddenly use a plural noun? Are the chief priests involved? Unnamed soldiers? What's going on here? Well, if we check our scriptural testimony, we see Matthew is giving us a nearly word-for-word quotation of Exodus 4:19, where an angel speaks to Moses and says, "All those who sought your life have died." Matthew uses the plural to cleverly link Jesus' escape to Moses' escape in Exodus, proving that the tiniest grammatical clue can blow a case wide open. By deliberately using the plural inflection, Matthew is secretly telling the reader, Jesus is the new Moses, bringing a new Exodus. It's a profound theological revelation, literally hidden in a single letter S. Now that your detective's toolbox is completely full, I really encourage you to dive back into the text and uncover the profound truths waiting to be discovered. We've seen how bridging the gap from observation to interpretation isn't about guesswork, right? It's about following the evidence. It's about respecting context, understanding word usage, honoring genre, and letting the text itself set the terms of the investigation. So grab your magnifying glass, the clues are sitting right there on the page. What textual mysteries will you solve next?